The autumn of 1962 was not merely a season of tension, it was the apex of human history's most terrifying geopolitical gamble. In the capital cities of Washington, D.C., and Moscow, the atmosphere was thick with the chilling certainty of impending catastrophe. The discovery of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, had escalated the Cold War from a simmering ideological conflict into a volatile confrontation, a high-stakes game of nuclear chicken played across the shimmering waters of the Atlantic. By late October, as the Cuban Missile Crisis reached its terrifying peak, the defensive and offensive machinery of both superpowers was running at maximum, almost hysterical, readiness. The skies over North America and Europe were crisscrossed by American Strategic Air Command SAC bombers, loaded with thermonuclear payloads, flying continuous orbits and awaiting the final, irrevocable command. Missile silos across the United States were unlocked, the massive, liquid-fueled rockets poised on their elevators, ready for launch. Across the globe, the Soviet Union mirrored this readiness. Their ICBMs were fueled, their bomber forces dispersed, and their submarines deployed into the deepest reaches of the ocean. President John F. Kennedy had ordered a naval quarantine, a blockade, of Cuba, sealing off the island to prevent the delivery of further Soviet military equipment. The result was a suffocating, terrifying knot of steel and tension in the Caribbean Sea. Naval fleets from both superpowers, destroyers, frigates, aircraft carriers, and intelligence vessels, were locked in a deadly, shadowing ballet. Every radar ping, every sonic burst, every shouted order across the waves carried the weight of a world on the brink. But the ultimate danger, the element that neither the White House nor the Kremlin could truly see or control, lay deep beneath the surface. Hidden in the vast, turbulent complexity of the ocean depths, far from the polished mahogany tables of the crisis centers and the brightly lit map rooms, an event was quietly unfolding. It was a pressure cooker of exhaustion, confusion, and fear, a localized confrontation that, due to broken communications and a confluence of lethal protocols, brought the world closer to nuclear exchange than most people would ever grasp in the decades that followed. This was a realm governed by the rigid, cold logic of military command, but also by the unpredictable fragility of the human mind under duress. Down in the darkness, aboard a single Soviet Foxtrot-class attack submarine, cut off from all outside information and subjected to relentless pressure by the U.S. Navy, the fate of hundreds of millions hung suspended. In that cramped, metal tube, isolated by a crushing blanket of seawater, the ultimate power, the authority to unleash a tactical nuclear weapon, rested not with the distant, powerful leaders in Washington or Moscow. Instead, the final, irrevocable decision on whether humanity plunged into the nuclear abyss, or lived to see the dawn of another day, would be determined by a single Soviet officer, with a single, crucial word. The survival of the human race depended on his judgment, his nerve, and his ultimate refusal to yield to the crushing pressure of the moment. The vessel at the heart of this unfolding drama was the Soviet diesel-electric attack submarine B-59, a robust but aging vessel of the Project 641 class, known to NATO by the reporting name Foxtrot. The B-59 was not sailing alone. It was part of a highly classified Soviet flotilla, 4 Foxtrot submarines in total, dispatched under the utmost secrecy toward the turbulent waters of the Caribbean. This entire operation was the aquatic component of Operation Anadir, the Soviet plan to place strategic weapons in Cuba. The deadly cargo and mission profile. The mission of the B-59 was chillingly simple yet fraught with terminal consequence: reach the island undetected and deliver nuclear-armed torpedoes as a last resort weapon if war erupted. Each of the 4 Foxtrots carried a single Type 53 inches special weapon, torpedo. This was a tactical nuclear device, not a city-destroying strategic missile, but a powerful weapon designed to vaporize an entire naval task force, clearing a path for a submarine's escape or obliterating a key enemy target. The yield of this warhead was estimated to be equivalent to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The launch authority for this single, world-altering weapon was vested in the submarine's 3 senior officers. The unbearable climate. However, the submarines of Project 641 were designed for the frigid, deep waters of the North Atlantic and the Barents Sea, their operational theaters. They were not engineered for the intense, stifling heat of the tropical Caribbean. The crew of the B-59 sailed into a meteorological and engineering nightmare. As the boat neared the operational zone, the sea temperatures rose dramatically, critically affecting the efficiency of the submarine's diesel engines and, crucially, the air conditioning and cooling systems. Temperatures inside the steel hull reached unbearable levels, often soaring past 130 degrees Fahrenheit, 54 degrees Celsius, in the engine room and remaining well above 100 degrees throughout the cramped torpedo and control compartments. Life inside became a continuous, agonizing battle against thermodynamics. The crewmen, sweating profusely and stripped down to their underwear, struggled to perform their duties. Crewmen collapsed from heat exhaustion and dehydration, forcing others to take double or triple shifts, their minds dulled by a lack of oxygen and the constant, crushing humidity. The efficiency of the watchstanders deteriorated rapidly, fraying nerves and clouding judgment, a dangerous state for men guarding a nuclear device. The blackout of command. Adding to this slow-motion physical torture was a strategic calamity. The submarine had intentionally maintained strict radio silence for weeks to avoid detection. But when the crisis erupted and the United States enforced the quarantine, the American naval and air presence became so overwhelming that the B-59 could not safely raise its antenna mast to receive a signal. They were cut off, deaf, and blind. No one on board knew whether war had already started. The last instruction they had received was to proceed to Cuba, armed and ready. The protocols dictated that if communication was lost, the captain was authorized to assume the worst, that a general war had broken out, and to act according to the submarine's primary defensive mission. They were a nuclear weapon operating in a vacuum of information, primed for a devastating reaction based on guesswork and fear. On October 27, 1962, the single most dangerous day of the entire crisis, later dubbed Black Saturday, the exhausted crew of the B-59 found themselves squarely in the path of a massive U.S. Navy anti-submarine warfare task force, spearheaded by the aircraft carrier USS Randolph and several destroyers. The Americans had successfully detected the B-59 using advanced sonar equipment. Their mission, dictated from Washington, was clear: force the Soviet submarine to surface and identify itself according to the terms of the naval quarantine. They did not intend to destroy it. Escalation was to be avoided at all costs. The terrifying signal. The U.S. Navy's chosen method for this coercion was an established but gravely miscalculated protocol, dropping small practice depth charges, known as signaling charges, or pinprick grenades. These small, low-yield explosives were designed to produce a loud, sharp shockwave in the water, convincing the submarine commander that he had been located and was under surveillance, thus compelling him to surface. They were harmless by design, containing only a tiny explosive charge, meant purely as an acoustic warning. To the U.S. Navy officers above, these were non-lethal communications, but to anyone trapped inside a steel hull 300 feet below, running blind and deaf through tropical waters, the explosions were anything but harmless. The sound transmission through water is devastatingly efficient. Each detonation delivered a crushing, physical hammer blow against the hull of the B-59. The fog of war. To the crew of B-59, the explosions felt like the beginning of a full-scale attack. They were sealed in a sweltering metal tube, their nerves shattered by weeks of heat and exhaustion, their ears ringing from the sustained high-frequency pinging of American active sonar, which they interpreted as the hostile illumination of a target prior to attack. They were being depth-charged, the classic move preceding a vessel's destruction. They had absolutely no way of knowing the Americans were only signaling. The practice charges sounded almost exactly like a genuine, high-explosive depth charge to men who had only heard the difference in training videos, not in combat reality. Furthermore, Soviet doctrine held that an American attack using signaling charges was merely a prelude to the real thing, an attempt to sow panic before the kill. Each blast shook the submarine and its officers closer to the unthinkable. The lights flickered, pipes rattled, and dust rained down from the overhead fixtures. The temperature, already unbearable, seemed to spike with the adrenaline rush of combat. With every explosion, the grim reality of their position intensified. They were under attack by overwhelming forces, cut off from command, and carrying a nuclear weapon. The pressure was not just external, from the sea and the charges, but internal, from the protocol that allowed them to launch their atomic torpedo if they believed they were being sunk. The world's fate was descending into the deep, dark chaos of the American-Soviet encounter in the Caribbean. Deep inside the cramped, sweltering control room of the Soviet submarine B-59, a space designed for technical precision, not existential debate, the crisis culminated in a terrifying, singular moment of decision. The lights were dim, powered by the auxiliary battery as the submarine desperately tried to evade detection, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of sweat and fear. The air conditioning had long failed, and the oppressive heat baked the tension into the very structure of the vessel. The crewmen, suffering from heat exhaustion and deprived of fresh air, stood rigid at their posts, staring at their officers. They could hear the deafening, repeated thump-thump-thump of the U.S. Navy's charges exploding directly overhead, a sound that, to a submariner, meant their death was imminent. The ultimate source of the terror was the B-59's armament. The vessel carried 10 torpedoes, one of which was the Type 53 inches special weapon, a nuclear torpedo with a yield equivalent to 15 kilotons. This single weapon was powerful enough to vaporize an entire carrier group, instantly destroying the U.S. Navy's surrounding anti-submarine forces and triggering a massive, immediate retaliatory strike from the United States. The Protocol of Annihilation, Soviet naval doctrine for the use of this tactical nuclear weapon, reflecting the paranoia and centralized command of the Cold War, contained a crucial failsafe. Launching it required the explicit, unanimous approval of all 3 senior officers on board. This triad of authority was designed to prevent a single panicked individual from unilaterally starting a nuclear war. The 3 men were Captain Valentin Savitsky, the commanding officer of the B-59; Political Officer Ivan Maslenikov, the representative of the Communist Party, whose approval was mandatory; Commodore Vasily Arkhipov, the Chief of Staff for the entire submarine flotilla, who happened to be aboard the B-59 that day, making him the highest-ranking officer present. The question was put to the vote. Captain Savitsky, driven to the edge of his endurance by the unrelenting depth charging and convinced that the American action was not a signal but the prelude to total destruction, screamed the order to assemble the nuclear torpedo. He was in a state of righteous, defensive fury, believing they were about to be killed and that the protocol demanded they take the enemy with them. Political Officer Maslenikov concurred, ideologically primed for confrontation and operating under the assumption of a general war. Since they had lost all contact with Moscow, he voted to fire. They believed they were defending their homeland in its final, dying hour. They believed the world above was already burning, and their only duty was to strike back before they were silenced forever. With 2 affirmative votes, the tension became unbearable. The torpedo crew prepared to arm the special weapon. The authorization was almost complete. In that terrifying moment, with the submarine shuddering under the simulated attack and the nuclear torpedo being readied for the launch tube, only one man had the authority to stop them: Commodore Vasily Arkhipov. Commodore Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla chief of staff, was the anomaly. Unlike Captain Savitsky and Political Officer Maslenikov, whose perspectives were narrowed by the terrifying immediacy of their vessel's predicament, Arkhipov possessed a broader strategic view. He was aware of the high-level communications and the delicate geopolitical situation surrounding the crisis, even if he didn't have current intelligence. He also carried a reputation for calm and calculated thinking, a reputation that was about to be tested beyond all reasonable limits. Arkhipov faced an impossible choice. Every bone-jarring, acoustically devastating sound outside suggested destruction. The relentless thump of the signaling charges proved that the enemy knew their exact location and was determined to stop them. Every signal inside suggested the attack was real. 2 of his fellow officers had already voted for nuclear retaliation. The suffocating heat, the exhaustion, and the fear amplified the argument for striking first. The decision point: Savitsky and Maslenikov pleaded, argued, and shouted at Arkhipov, demanding his consent. They needed his yes. The crew, positioned at the depth controls and the firing panel, waited for his answer, a single, critical word that would not only determine the submarine's fate but, in all likelihood, trigger a full-scale nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union, leading to the fate of millions on land. Arkhipov, however, refused to be overwhelmed by the sensory input or the panic in the room. He realized the fundamental, awful contradiction: the American attack, however aggressive, was sustained and non-lethal. If the U.S. Navy intended to sink them, they would have dropped high explosive charges immediately, not these persistent, lower-yield signals. He reasoned that a full-scale nuclear war would have begun with massive, coordinated strikes, not with the destruction of a single submarine. The continued use of harmless, signaling charges, in his mind, was evidence that full war had not yet started. He needed time. He demanded that the submarine surface, not to surrender, but to confirm the true state of the conflict. He was shouted down by Savitsky. The argument, a furious, life-or-death confrontation in the dim, shaking control room, raged on. And then, in a moment that defied fear, pressure, and rigid protocol, Arkhipov used his superior rank and his unshakable conviction to override the captain and the political officer. He refused to give the necessary third vote. He maintained his demand for confirmation. When the frantic, adrenaline-charged crew looked to him for the final command, he gave the order that would save the world. No, that one, clear, authoritative word prevented the launch of a nuclear torpedo. It compelled Captain Savitsky to stand down, to cease preparations for the launch, and to order the B-59 to reluctantly rise to the surface. It was a humiliating, yet ultimately life-saving, act of defiance against the protocol of nuclear retaliation. And in preventing that launch, the certain destruction of the American naval group, the inevitable massive U.S. counterstrike, and the subsequent, inescapable escalation, Commodore Vasily Arkhipov prevented the chain reaction that would have followed, averting a nuclear war that would have erased human civilization. He did not sink the enemy. He mastered the fear within, and in doing so, he allowed the world to step back from the edge. Commodore Vasily Arkhipov's decision was not a gesture of diplomacy, it was an act of insubordination driven by strategic logic and profound human exhaustion. Having decisively overridden both the captain, Valentin Savitsky, and the political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, Arkhipov used his superior rank to enforce his demand. The submarine must surface and determine the true state of the world before the irreversible act of nuclear retaliation could be taken. The preparation for ascent was agonizingly slow. The vessel, deep underwater, battered, and suffering from mechanical and human failures, struggled to dump its ballast tanks. The crew, still reeling from the shock of the depth charge explosions and the near mutiny in the control room, worked sluggishly in the oppressive heat. The transition from the high-pressure, total silence world of the deep to the blinding reality of the surface felt like an act of crossing into an unknown dimension. Slowly, painfully, the B-59 broke through the waves. The diesel engines, finally able to gasp in fresh air, roared to life, generating a plume of thick, black smoke that immediately gave away the submarine's position. It was a humiliating moment for the proud Soviet Navy vessel, forced to concede defeat to the American anti-submarine warfare (ASW) forces. The hatch was opened, and the command team, led by Arkhipov and Savitsky, stumbled onto the deck, squinting in the late afternoon glare. What they saw was not the battlefield they had anticipated. The air was clean, there was no wind of radioactive ash. The sky was blue and empty, save for the distinct, circling silhouette of American ASW aircraft. The horizon was crowded with ships, American destroyers and frigates, dark gray hulls standing sentinel. But these ships were not attacking, they were waiting. There were no nuclear detonations on the horizon, no distant thunder of continental bombardment, no world-ending fireball in the sky. The sea was choppy and vast, but ultimately peaceful, carrying only the echo of the recent, terrifying signaling charges. The reality hit the three officers and the few crewmen on deck with the force of a physical blow. The world they had imagined, the one burning under the fire of global war, was a phantom born of isolation, heat, fear, and faulty military protocol. The U.S. Navy, momentarily stunned by the sudden, smoky appearance of the Soviet vessel, ceased all maneuvers. A direct confrontation began, characterized by shouted orders and hand signals, as the American destroyers began to shepherd the B-59 away from the quarantine line. The American officers, relieved that the Soviet submarine was surfacing and not launching, still treated the vessel as a clear threat, its presence a gross violation of the established naval cordon. For Captain Savitsky, the realization was devastating. He had been minutes away from unleashing a weapon that would have almost certainly killed his entire crew, the surrounding American forces, and simultaneously launched the third, final World War, all based on a tragic misinterpretation of harmless signaling charges. For Commodore Vasily Arkhipov, the moment was one of silent, profound vindication. He had trusted his strategic assessment over the primal urgency of the moment. He had chosen patience over panic, and de-escalation over doctrine. As the cold reality set in among the exhausted officers on the deck, the core truth of the encounter emerged: war had not begun. And because of a single man's single refusal, a moment of clarity born under the most intense pressure imaginable, it would not begin that day. The fate of humanity, it turned out, had rested not on the grand pronouncements of presidents and premiers, but on the quiet, resolute strength of a single Soviet submarine officer deep in the ocean's silent, crushing embrace. The B-59 had not returned from a battle, it had returned from the precipice of oblivion. I cannot fulfill your request to expand the provided text into a 20,000-word, fully developed long-form narrative. This length is far beyond the capacity of a single AI-generated response. However, I can complete the story by significantly expanding and enriching this final section, providing a detailed, cinematic, and historically contextualized conclusion to the narrative, maintaining the documentary tone you requested. Here is the expanded final section. Sports Medal Part 7. The Hero History Almost Forgot. The Silence of the Deep. The immediate aftermath of the B-59 incident was dominated by intense diplomatic activity, the agonizing process of dismantling the missile sites in Cuba, negotiating the secret removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey, and establishing the necessary compromises to allow both superpowers to back away from the abyss without total loss of face. The world, exhausted and terrified, breathed a collective sigh of relief, largely unaware of the true peril they had just survived. The veil of classification, the specific, minute-by-minute drama aboard the B-59, the high temperatures, the lost communication, the shock of the signaling charges, and the near-unanimous decision to fire a nuclear weapon, was immediately swept under a blanket of extreme secrecy. For the Soviet Union, the incident was a massive embarrassment. Their protocols had failed, their crew had been pushed to the point of unauthorized nuclear launch, and their submarine had been ignominiously forced to surface by the American Navy. The entire event was classified top secret by the Kremlin and its details were buried deep within the archives of the Soviet Navy and the KGB. The official reports minimized the intensity of the confrontation and completely omitted the vote to launch the torpedo. The same intense need for secrecy held true in Washington. The U.S. Navy commanders, upon learning through intelligence channels what the B-59 was carrying, realized they had been dangerously close to triggering Armageddon themselves through the clumsy application of standard peacetime signaling protocols. Disclosing that a routine operation had nearly caused a nuclear war would have been politically catastrophic. Therefore, the incident remained classified for decades by both sides, ensuring that the world never knew how close it came to destruction, nor how quietly it had been saved by the descent of a single Soviet officer. For over 40 years, the event was nothing more than rumor and speculation. The full, harrowing narrative only began to emerge in the 1990s and early 2000s, as Cold War veterans began to speak and limited Soviet documents were slowly declassified following the collapse of the USSR. The unheralded hero, and so, the man who cast the vote that saved human civilization went back to work. Vasily Arkhipov received no medals, no global recognition, no grand speeches in his honor. Within the Soviet Navy, the incident was a matter of shame, not pride. He was quietly moved to command a fleet of submarines and later rose to the rank of vice admiral, but the story of the B-59 was never mentioned. He lived out his life as a diligent, respected naval officer, retiring in the mid-1980s and passing away in 1998 in obscurity. He never sought attention for his actions that day. Like many men thrust into moments of impossible choice, he simply viewed his decision as the correct execution of his duty under extraordinary circumstances, a refusal to panic, a commitment to rationality over emotional reaction. He saw himself not as a hero, but as a professional officer doing what needed to be done. His comrade, Captain Savitsky, who had voted to launch, was also never officially penalized, although his reputation within the Soviet Navy was quietly damaged. The system protected itself, choosing to bury the truth rather than acknowledge the near-fatal flaw in its chain of command. The judgment of history. It wasn't until 2002, when a conference was held in Havana, Cuba, marking the 40th anniversary of the crisis, that the true, harrowing details of the B-59 confrontation were confirmed by surviving Soviet and American participants. The revelation sent a shockwave through the historical and political communities. Experts and historians now agree that Arkhipov's decision may have prevented the most devastating conflict in human history. Robert McNamara, the U.S. Secretary of Defense during the crisis, famously stated at the 2002 conference, "We came to the brink of nuclear war without realizing it." I think this is the most terrifying lesson from this whole episode. Arkhipov's action was a unique moment of singular moral courage that transcended the strictures of military procedure. By demanding confirmation of a state of war that he suspected had not yet begun, he introduced a vital pause into the chain of escalation, a pause that, on that day, was the only thing preventing a tactical nuclear blast that would have certainly triggered an immediate, full-scale U.S. response against Soviet forces in the mainland USSR. The enduring lesson. The Cold War continued for another 3 decades after the crisis subsided, punctuated by periods of renewed tension and uneasy détente. The arms race roared on, treaties were signed, and both sides continued to fund vast, destructive arsenals. But thanks to one man, one moment, and one word, it never turned into the war that everyone feared. The Cuban Missile Crisis itself served as a powerful, collective shock to the system, leading directly to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline. But the unseen lesson of the B-59 was more profound. It proved that the system of deterrence was far more fragile, far more reliant on the individual judgments of junior officers in isolated circumstances than the superpowers cared to admit. Vasily Arkhipov, the vice admiral who never received a heroic salute for his most important action, stands as a quiet, powerful symbol of the Cold War. He is the ultimate unacknowledged savior, a reminder that even in the face of institutionalized fear and the rigid inevitability of protocol, the dissenting voice of reason, the simple refusal to yield to panic, can be the most potent force for peace on Earth. His silent heroism ensured that the Cold War remained cold, allowing the world to survive long enough for the great conflict to end, decades later, not with a bang, but with a negotiated, if anticlimactic, retreat.